Hello watch enthusiasts. Now the collector's market for vintage watches is extremely strong in terms of collecting certain models. These models which hold certain market strength are pieces like the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, the Patek Philippe Nautilus, or indeed a number of petrol calendars in fact from Patek Philippe as well. Then one sees in the sports watch realm a number of Rolexes from the mid-century, which really do hold their own in terms of collectability, such as the Daytona as of recent auctions, and also certain Speedmasters from Omega also command very major value. But today I'd like to speak about something a bit different, because whilst there are a great deal of auction reports on the internet, I think it's interesting sometimes to consider watches which will perhaps be collectible in future. And so today I'd like to speak about what I would class as modern classics, released relatively recently, at least much more recently than the vintage pieces which are so collectible, and which I think will hold their own in future in terms of being something aside from the general crowd. And what prompted me to make this video is because I've seen a number of articles which do address this sort of topic before, but usually they state and cite models which are particularly popular today, such as pieces like the Tudor Black Bay, or indeed the current Rolex Submariner. And I find that whilst these pieces are certainly wonderful pieces to own in the current day, I think the idea of these pieces being heavily collectible in future is difficult to consider on the basis that they're extremely popular and have been sold in very large numbers, with elements such as vintage appeal, which I feel doesn't bode well for a design which will be timeless in terms of catching the collector's eye in 10 or 20 years. And so without any further ado, the first watch is a piece which is seen on a great deal of wrists, but I think because of its importance historically, will hold its own for a number of years to come. Released in 1993, the Omega Seamaster 300M was very much a model which restored Omega to former glory. Now, in the 10 previous years in the 1980s, Omega's products and their line had deteriorated since their position in the 1960s and early 70s. And so at this point, with the help of Jean-Claude Biver, the Omega Seamaster 300M was crucial to re-establishing Omega as a world-class brand. And that's really the crux of my argument for this watch being a piece which will hold value in future. Now, this is a model which I don't believe will hold value in the way, for example, a Rolex Daytona does at the moment, in terms of the vintage pieces. I really don't believe that because of the sheer numbers of these produced. But I think the importance of this model will become more apparent to collectors as a piece to have in a collection alongside other models as well. Because this piece was released in 1993 and came in a quartz version at the time, and also the early ones also came with an automatic caliber 1109, which was based on the ETA 2892. However, soon in this line, Omega replaced that 1109 caliber with the more heavily developed 1120, also based on the ETA 2892, but this time with a redesigned automatic winding section, which is why it in fact looks quite different to a normal ETA 2892, and thus made this watch a more efficient timekeeper. And this piece was a 41mm model that did also come in a 36mm mid-size model. But it's a watch which has a design which is both classic and contemporary. It shares design cues with older Omega Seamasters such as those lyre-style lugs, and also with elements on the dial such as those plongeur-style hands, but was a fundamentally modern retake on this design, with skeletonized hands this time, that wonderful sculpt bezel, the helium escape valve placed in that opposite position to the crown. And so this watch was a design which was both very dressy in terms of its concept with that bracelet, but also a thoroughly professional dive watch, setting this watch apart from its competitors. And of course one can't forget the fact that this watch also played a very major role in Omega's development, because in 2006 this watch was updated with the second generation of these Seamasters, which still retained the aluminium bezel, that wave dial, but improved on the model quite significantly, elongating the hands and also rearranging it somewhat to make it more modern with a redesigned dial, applied logo and red text. But most crucially, this included a version of the 2500 caliber from Omega. And the 2500 caliber was their first version of the co-axial escapement movement. And this was also based on the ETA 2892. But until this point, Omega had been using the A and B versions of this movement, running at the higher beat rate of 4 Hz, which is the standard beat rate for the industry. But these were in some ways unreliable, and the early versions to take on this caliber really didn't quite cut the mustard in the way that one would expect from Omega. However, with this 2500C, a lower beat rate was adopted of 25,200 vibrations per hour, and the movement became a very reliable, very accurate timekeeper, with a far extended service interval, and became really the ultimate version of this ETA movement, creating a very interesting direction for Omega and also proving the fact that the coaxial escapement was there to stay. And then of course with its glossy dial, its ceramic bezel, and also its redesigned and sharpened case and bracelet, the 2012 version marked really the final point for this design, and again an interesting chapter in the story of this pretty iconic concept of a watch. And this also did enjoy certain technical improvements with the 2500D caliber, including a rebuilt and a re-engineered coaxial escapement, really reaching the pinnacle of this first stage of the coaxial movement. And whilst the Seamaster 300M is by no means, during this particular period, the top of the range model in Omega's range, bearing in mind the Planet Ocean came out, I think the fact that this watch represented such a period of change and upheaval for Omega, as a brand re-becoming what it previously was as a luxury watch manufacturer, makes this watch a very interesting period, and also a very interesting model in terms of this transition. Now, of course, this is really very heavily linked to Jean-Claude Biver's re-engineering of the brand's design and image, and in many ways this was the spearhead of this work, and I think to understand this one simply has to look at the number of these sold, which is pretty staggering. And of course the 2018 version reinvents the concept with a very heavily improved movement and a redesigned case and dial, but I think in terms of being a collector's item, this period of Seamaster 300s marks an interesting time and certainly one worthy of consideration as a model which reshaped a brand. In many ways, this second piece I'd like to speak about did exactly the opposite of that Omega, in the sense that rather than reinventing the brand that created it, it reinforced the values which we love from this brand. And this is the Jaeger-LeCoultre Master Control, a watch which revolutionised the way in which watches were tested, but also demonstrated something which I think has always been true of JLC, which is the fact that these were watches for the watchmaker, for the person who appreciates subtle engineering and technology which is not groundbreaking, so to speak, but which is extremely well executed. Released in 1992, the Master Control series provided a very new way of testing movements, and originally this Master Control series was based around the caliber 889, an automatic caliber from JLC. And whilst this movement isn't perhaps as well renowned and as well recognised as, for example, the 920, which went into the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak and also the Patek Philippe Nautilus, this is a movement which has been seen certainly around the block and seen in some of the watches produced by the Holy Trinity of watchmaking. Notably, it has been used in some forms by Vacheron-Constantin. And in terms of this movement's testing in the Master Control, one saw something which was genuinely very impressive. So the full tests for this movement lasted 6 weeks and 1,000 hours, as is very proudly emblazoned on the caseback. And this watch was tested to be able to resist impacts, as well as variations in humidity, in addition to being tested to its full water resistance, of course, and within temperatures of between 4 and 40 degrees C. Then the watch was also subjected to long periods of time on the watch winder to simulate consistent and constant wear, to be able to demonstrate that the watch was able to continue functioning very accurately, irrespective of how daily life was going on. And what I think is impressive about this type of regulation is that it's not an abstract sort of regulation which is based purely upon how it's regulated when not being worn. This is a type of testing which is very fluid in terms of demonstrating how the owner is going to wear the watch and how it will need to perform during daily life. And whilst other models have been added to the Master Control series, simply a model with, for example, the caliber 899, the successor to the 889, which is very similar in construction but features ceramic ball bearings, amongst a series of other changes to be able to bring it up to date, that simplicity of simply having the time and the date is echoed through this collection. The cases are very elegantly done with beveled edges and a simple profile which gives real beauty to these watches. And their design is subtle, understated, but quintessentially JLC, whether one goes for a very simple dial in black or white with applied indices, or if one goes for one of the rather curious sector dials produced for the 25th anniversary of this line, it's a watch which is quintessentially JLC. It celebrates the fact that this is a brand which is proud of its background of producing watches which are of extremely high quality and very honest about their quality, which is what I love about this brand, and what I think adds to the value of this product line, as a line which is subtly collectible. In many ways I would compare this to the Patek Philippe Calatrava of the modern day. And so I feel this piece really will become an icon of enduring quality and also of the values of a brand which unwaveringly follows this tradition without any sort of concern for particular innovation in terms of doing anything particularly radical, but instead produces a very high quality product, and one which is consistently interesting, and certainly is beautifully executed too. Now, this third watch doesn't represent a period of change for a brand, nor does it represent a celebration of what that brand stands for. Instead, this piece represents the end of an era and also the power of scarcity. Because this is the Rolex Sea-Dweller 4000, reference 116600. Now, if Rolex is one thing, it's conservative. And so the advent of a short-lived model in the Rolex catalogue is relatively rare. But certainly with this piece one does see a short-lived model, because this piece was only produced for 3 years, from 2014 to 2017. Because this piece came during a period of change in the Sea-Dweller line. Because previously the Sea-Dweller in its 40mm version had been discontinued altogether and replaced by the Deep Sea, giving an immense, almost 4,000 metre water resistance. However, a certain amount of demand reintroduced this 40mm version, with its water resistance still the same as in previous decades, at 1220 metres with the helium escape valve. This watch didn't even take the maxi case with the wider lugs of the modern Submariner, instead opting for a more narrow style of case, which was still wider than the original, but was much closer to what we'd come to expect. The watch was inevitably much thicker than the Submariner, but I think that reshaping of the watch made it appeal to a great deal of collectors. Also, it gained the ceramic bezel insert, but this time fully graduated, and the matted dial, which gave a more professional tone to this watch over the normal Submariner, whilst the suppression of the Cyclops on the crystal again gained a certain amount of followers. And this piece wasn't necessarily the most popular, and certainly sales of this watch never came anywhere near the Submariner, because it's reasonable to see why people would look at this watch and wonder why they were paying a significant amount more than the Submariner, bearing in mind the fact that it was the same size and looked very similar at a glance. But to those who enjoy these watches and their history, I can certainly see the appeal. This watch even added to the already brilliant glide lock technology on the class of the Submariner, with the addition of an extra dive extension in addition to what one already had, giving this watch real appeal across the board. But almost as quickly as it appeared, this watch disappeared, as it was replaced by the more modern 43mm version with red text on the dial and a Cyclops. And this piece was certainly divisive, but despite its inferior specifications where movements were concerned, and also its much more classical style and more understated appearance, I think this 3-year production of this Sea-Dweller, and the fact that it aligns so closely with what collectors would more readily associate with the Sea-Dweller, will make this a real icon of the period, and I think perhaps even a collector's item in future years. When Germany came away from communism at the start of the 1990s, this brand, Lange & Söhne, was very much a brand which had been unable to work during that mid-20th century period, and so really was starting from a certain disadvantage by comparison to other luxury equivalents that it would later compete with. And many would describe the Lange 1 as being the watch which really developed the brand into what it is today. However, I would disagree to a certain extent, because for me, the watch which created what we best know Lange for today was the Datagraph. And the Datagraph was like nothing else on the market. This 39mm platinum watch, as it was first released in 1999, was a slab-sided piece with exquisite finishing on the sides of the case, and a dial which was again unique, with a large double date at 12, Lange and Söhne plastered at the 12 o'clock position across that tachymeter, in addition to the inclusion of Roman numerals and those iconic offset subdials. But the detailing was simply phenomenal. These pieces had finishing on the hands and on the subdials, in addition to those gold chetons you see over various parts of the movement, which just add to this watch's visual beauty as a piece which really is at the apex of quality. And various versions were available, with the early versions in platinum coming with this reverse panda style of dial, and also a strap or either an integrated or separate bracelet. Later on there was the addition of gold versions to the range, but really this piece which I'm referring to in this particular example is the first generation of these pieces before they were replaced by the up-down. And whilst this watch is technically inferior to later datagraphs, I feel its historical value in terms of establishing a Lange & Söhne as a superlative creator of chronographs is undeniable. Because this piece featured a movement which really was the origin of pretty much all Lange chronographs after this. because it was the L951.1, a 40 joule caliber, which was manually wound with a 36-hour power reserve, which ran at 18,000 vibrations per hour. Of course, also featured a flyback function, in addition to a column wheel, a lateral clutch for additional beauty, and 405 parts, each finished exquisitely, in a way which really we've come to expect from this brand. And really this movement is just as much a demonstration of technological grandeur as it is of visual spectacle, because it technologically has small details which just stand aside from others on the market. And certainly when this watch came out, it was 8 years before Patek Philippe released their own in-house chronograph, and several more years than that, in fact, before Vacheron Constantin joined them, creating an additional layer, I think, to the interest behind this movement. But it's the details such as the instant change of the minutes on the chronograph, or the fact that this watch has these wonderful gold chatons placed on it within the movement, and so on has this reduction in wear, but also a really very beautiful demonstration of decoration. And the movement itself is thoroughly decorated throughout. On all of the bridges one sees a very fine level of decoration, and of course the bridges are German silver, giving them this patina over time. Then the balance cock is hand engraved to be unique and thoroughly beautiful, and the general build of the movement means there's a great deal of depth to it, allowing one to peer between the cogs and wheels, and really allow the eye to be caught. And frankly, the praise of this generation of Datagraph and of this movement is really demonstrated no better than the fact that Philippe Dufour has described this movement as the greatest chronograph movement ever made, which I think is quite remarkable, in addition to the fact that this watch and this movement was the basis for really the range of chronographs that one sees today from Lange and Söhne. So one sees the 1815 chronograph, the up-down version of the Datagraph, the double split, the triple split, and the perpetual calendar version of the Datagraph are all based on this original movement, which I think is quite remarkable, and thus I think does sing the praises of this generation of watch, because it did form the backbone of what today is one of the absolute powerhouses of the high horology industry. And so I think the fact that this watch is already selling for auction for significant prices, and the fact that this watch has such significance for the brand, which is ever growing, really does demonstrate the fact that it really will, at least in my eyes, become a modern classic. Now this final piece I'd like to speak about is an unlikely choice for this video, but I feel no less of a good one, because this is the relatively new double impulse chronometer from Charles Frodsham. And Charles Frodsham is a very old British name, an English name in fact, in the world of watchmaking. And what I find fascinating is that this brand has been operating continuously for 184 years, admittedly under different management, and is no longer fully family owned, but I do find it quite remarkable this brand has been able to continue in London when a large degree of British watchmaking has gone away, really. And so this marks an interesting piece because I think it marks a balance and a meeting point between the past and also the future of English watchmaking. But before I speak about this watch's historical importance and the reason why I think this watch may well be a future classic, I'd like to talk about what makes this watch so interesting and stand apart in terms of its movement, its case, and its general design. From the perspective of being a dress watch, this piece is very sizable at 42.2mm, but only by 10.5mm thick. But the reason for this is largely down to the movement, but also the fact that those who are familiar with older chronometer wristwatches which were derived from pocket watches will be familiar with the fact that these watches, such as some IWCs, were of a larger size to accommodate these movements, which I think makes this size both charming, but also historically very interesting. And the watch is available in 3 different metals, that being stainless steel, which is a very special type of stainless steel for this watch, 18 karat rose gold, or 22 karat gold. And what's interesting I think about the 22 karat gold version, whilst being a little bit more expensive than the 18 karat rose gold version, is that it's forged, pressed and hard rolled, which means it has the same equivalent hardness as the 18 karat gold version, despite being much more pure, which I think creates a very, very interesting demonstration of the technology which is being incorporated into this watch, which is both modern in terms of giving this additional functionality, but also fundamentally rooted in history. Such a philosophy also extends to the most interactive part of the watch, the dial. And the dial is, whilst appearing like porcelain or perhaps enamel, is a much more modern material of lapped ceramic to make it thinner, but also to give this durable surface to it, which means the entire dial will not age or deteriorate in the same way as enamel or indeed porcelain would crack. But in spite of this modernity, the rest of the dial is extremely charmingly and truly exquisitely classically done. One sees the traditional signature on the dial, with London being very clearly emblazoned on the dial. Then one has these applied markers, which are heat and hand thermally blued to create this purpley sort of tone, which appears uniform at a distance, but if one magnifies the dial, creates this wonderful level of detailing, which is also mirrored by the hands. And it's this attention to detail which really sets this piece apart, although I think the one part which is perhaps closest to the history of this brand, but also to the reason why I think this watch is such a marvel, is the movement. And the movement really is a spectacle of antique watchmaking, amalgamated with the modern world. And really it's when one starts to look at the movement that one notices that it's not really like anything else on the market. Its finishing appears very different. One has these matted surfaces, and these wet matted areas which appear dark grey, where a wet matting process has taken place, which has seemed by the brand has been declared as the best solution for this, and creates this very different and truly unique format for the decoration of surfaces. Then one has a particular type of copper alloy for the bridges, and then this rather unique and truly quite spectacular arrangement of having two separate spring barrels and two separate gear trains, leading to two separate, albeit connected by a single balance, escape wheels. And these operate alternatively to be able to give higher accuracy to the watch, and also one has this interesting setup whereby originally a style of detent escapement was going to be used, but due to not being necessarily the best option in every position, this was chosen as an alternative solution. And in a similar way as one might associate a co-axial escapement with reduced resistance and friction within the escapement, this has a similar result. But aside from technological mastery, there are several reasons why I feel that this watch does represent a piece which in future years I think will become a classic. Because this piece returns watchmaking to England in a way which I don't think has been done in quite this way before. And I look at it in this regard because there are a number of English watch brands out there, and certainly there are some very interesting products being produced, but because of the price range that these watches are being produced at, and also the sheer expertise of those working for Charles Frodsham, this is a watch which is almost entirely English. And so apart from the springs, the crystal for instance, and also some of the seals, this watch really is produced entirely in England. Now also one has this aspect which is that this movement is produced in a style which is fundamentally old-fashioned in terms of being compared to what we would normally associate with, for example, Patek Philippe. But in that way it's incredibly charming and in my eyes completely unique in the industry. At least from the way I see it, it's closest in terms of ideology to something like an FP Journe. But I feel in many ways this is even more honest about its background, because it follows directly on from people who have worked and developed English watchmaking for a very long period of time. Certainly 184 years for Charles Frodsham is a remarkable achievement, and certainly the background this watch is created from is from a background of individuals working with vintage pieces and antique pieces, such as Richard Stenning, who works for the brand and I've personally met, and it's fascinating always to discuss these sorts of things, but it really is incredible to see expertise like this coming together to create such a marvellous piece. And now I will conclude this video here, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of this video, and indeed of the various choices I made, because this video was very much based on my opinion rather than any sort of concrete facts or evidence, and so I'll be very interested to hear what you think. And if you did enjoy this video, then do follow me on Instagram at armonthewatchguy, as the same name as the channel, where there's a variety of different pieces in the form of horological photography and some videos and intros from my videos. Also, if you did enjoy the video, then do also like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armon the Watch Guy, out.